It was the Halloween of 2018, and the night was electric with excitement. My friends and I had been invited to a Halloween house party by someone we barely knew, but rumors were swirling about how wild and over the top these parties usually were. This year, however, there was a twist. The house they had rented for the party was rumored to be haunted, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town that had stood abandoned for years. We were skeptical, of course. Haunted houses were great for Halloween fun, but none of us actually believed in ghosts. It was just another spooky setting to enhance the night. The group consisted of me, Mark, Alex, and Tony. Your typical group of 20-somethings looking for a thrill. We figured if the party turned out to be a dud, we could always leave and find something else to do. The house loomed ahead of us as we drove up the gravel path. It was massive, with tall, arched windows, overgrown gardens, and a crumbling facade. Its once grand appearance was now marred by decades of neglect. A full moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows across the property, a perfect setting for a Halloween night. As we entered, we were greeted by the usual party scene. Costumed people everywhere, music blasting, and drinks flowing freely. The interior of the mansion was just as impressive as the outside, with sweeping staircases, high ceilings, and chandeliers that still hung from the ceiling, albeit covered in cobwebs. Everyone was talking about how spooky the place felt, but no one seemed too concerned. It was Halloween, after all. The whole point was to feel a little scared, but as the night wore on, strange things started happening. It began with the lights flickering. At first, we thought it was just the old wiring in the house, but it became more frequent. Entire rooms would suddenly plunge into darkness, only for the lights to snap back on a few seconds later. Then came the cold spots, pockets of freezing air in certain rooms, even though the rest of the house was warm from the crowd. About 2 hours into the party, someone suggested we explore the basement. According to the story, the house had belonged to an old family in the 1920s. One night, the youngest daughter had gone missing and no one had ever found her. Some said her spirit still lingered in the house, particularly in the basement where she was last seen. Half joking, we agreed to check it out. A small group of us, maybe 5 or 6, grabbed some flashlights and made our way downstairs. The basement was damp and musty, with a low ceiling and stone walls. There was barely any furniture, just a few old dusty crates and shelves lined with forgotten relics. As we ventured deeper into the basement, we found an old rusted door at the back. It creaked loudly as we pushed it open, revealing a small dark room. Inside, there was a single chair in the middle of the room, facing a wall. The air in there felt wrong, heavy, like it was thick with something unseen. Alex laughed nervously. "All right, this is where the haunted stuff happens, right?" But as soon as he said that, we heard it, a soft, scratching sound coming from the corner of the room. At first, we thought it was just a rat or some other animal, but the noise grew louder and closer. Everyone froze. The scratching stopped, only to be replaced by a quiet, eerie whisper that none of us could understand. Mark, trying to lighten the mood, said, "Okay, this is getting too real. Let's get out of here." We all agreed and quickly headed back upstairs. As we reached the main party again, we tried to laugh it off, telling ourselves it was probably just the wind or something harmless. But that's when things started getting worse. People began leaving in groups, complaining of sudden headaches, dizziness, and overwhelming feelings of dread. Then Tony, who had been acting weirdly quiet ever since we left the basement, suddenly turned pale and said he wasn't feeling well. We decided it was time to go, but as we were making our way to the door, the front door slammed shut on its own. Every window in the house rattled as if something was trying to keep us inside. The party came to an abrupt halt as panic spread through the crowd. People tried to leave, but every door seemed locked and the lights flickered wildly. That's when we saw her. At the top of the grand staircase, a figure in a white dress, her face hidden by her long dark hair. She stood there motionless, watching us. My heart raced, and for the first time that night I felt genuine fear. Someone screamed, and the figure vanished as quickly as she had appeared. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors swung open, and everyone rushed out of the house. We didn't look back. The next day we found out that the house had a history of paranormal activity. Previous tenants had reported seeing strange apparitions and hearing unsettling noises. Some even claimed to have seen the ghost of the missing girl. That Halloween party was the last one held in that house. No one ever talked about going back, and the mansion has since fallen further into decay. But I'll never forget that night. or the feeling that we had encountered something far more sinister than just a Halloween prank. What did you think of the story? Do you believe in haunted houses? Let us know in the comments. It was Halloween night, and I found myself wandering through the local carnival. I had gone on a whim, with no real plans for the evening, and the eerie allure of the brightly lit tents calling to me. The carnival was set up on the outskirts of town, far from the safety of crowded neighborhoods. It was the type of place where the rides creaked, the attractions felt old, and everything seemed to be just a bit out of place. The air was thick with the scent of sugary treats and damp hay. Screams of excitement echoed from the rickety rides, blending with eerie carnival music that drifted in and out like a fading memory. The night was cool, and the fog hung low, swirling around the feet of anyone who dared to wander too far from the lights. I strolled aimlessly through the carnival, watching children in costumes running between booths, their laughter mixing with the distant clink of games. Despite the crowd, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was alone in a way I couldn't quite explain. It was like the carnival existed in its own world, separate from the reality I knew, and I was just a visitor passing through. Something felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. As I wandered deeper into the carnival grounds, I noticed a part of the fair I hadn't seen before. Off to the side, past the main attractions, was an old faded tent. Unlike the other brightly lit areas, this one was shrouded in shadows, the light barely reaching it. A hand-painted sign outside read, "The Hall of Shadows. Enter if you dare." The letters were faded and cracked, as if the tent had been there for decades, untouched. Intrigued, I approached the entrance. Something about it made my skin crawl, but at the same time, I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was the desire for a scare, or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, I stepped through the flaps of the tent. Inside, the air was cold, unnaturally so. The dim light from outside barely penetrated the thick fabric of the tent. The space inside was cramped, with narrow hallways that twisted and turned, giving the impression that the tent was much larger on the inside than it appeared. Mirrors lined the walls, their surfaces tarnished and foggy, reflecting my distorted image back at me. As I made my way through the maze, I started to notice something strange. In the corner of my eye, I kept seeing a shadow, something or someone moving just out of view. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there, just my own reflection staring back at me from the warped mirrors. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I became. The atmosphere was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old tent settling. My footsteps echoed unnervingly in the enclosed space, and soon, even the sound of the carnival outside seemed to fade away, leaving me in an eerie quiet. Then, I saw it. In one of the mirrors, there was a figure behind me. It wasn't a reflection of myself. This figure was taller, its shape shadowy and unclear. My heart raced as I spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. Yet when I turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there, closer now. Its dark form loomed just inches behind where I stood in the reflection, though the space around me was empty. I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat. Every step I took, the figure in the mirror moved closer, though I couldn't see it anywhere but in the reflection. I tried to find my way back to the entrance, but the narrow hallways all seemed to blend together, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Panic set in. I began to run, my footsteps pounding against the dirt floor as I desperately tried to escape the tent. But no matter which way I turned, I couldn't find the exit. The figure in the mirrors was now right behind me, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. I could feel it, even if I couldn't see it directly. The air around me grew colder, and my breaths came in shallow gasps. Finally, I stumbled into a small room at the end of the maze. There was only one mirror in the center of the room, larger than the rest. My reflection stared back at me, but the shadowy figure wasn't there this time. I was alone, or so I thought. As I moved closer to the mirror, the air in the room seemed to shift. The light flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. And then, from the corner of the mirror, I saw it. The figure wasn't in the reflection this time. It was behind me. For real. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it was no longer just a reflection. The tent was no longer quiet. There was a low, guttural whisper that filled the air, a sound that sent shivers through my entire body. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Without thinking, I bolted for the exit, finding the entrance flap by sheer luck and stumbling out into the cold night air. The carnival was still there, lights flickering, people laughing, but something had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that tent hadn't stayed behind. It was Halloween night, and my friends and I decided to spend the weekend at a remote lake house. It was a tradition we had started a few years back, renting out a secluded spot to celebrate Halloween with bonfires, scary movies, and spooky stories. This year, we chose a lake house that none of us had been to before. It was advertised as an old, cozy cabin with a private dock on a lake deep in the woods, perfect for a memorable Halloween night. Or so we thought. The drive to the lake house was peaceful at first, with golden and red leaves falling on the deserted road. But as we got closer, the trees grew denser and the road narrower. By the time we reached the lake house, it was nearly dark, and a thick fog had rolled in off the water, casting an eerie glow over the entire area. The house itself was old, with creaking wooden steps and large windows that overlooked the lake. The place had clearly seen better days, but it added to the charm, or at least that's what we told ourselves. We quickly unloaded the car, eager to settle in before the cold really set in. We were a group of 6: me, Ethan, Jason, Tom, Chris, and our friend Matt, who had always been the one with the most enthusiasm for these kinds of trips. The first few hours were filled with the usual Halloween excitement. We watched a couple of scary movies, grilled some food, and sat by the fire pit telling ghost stories. But as the night progressed, something felt off. The atmosphere around the lake house seemed to change. The air grew still, and the usual sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, vanished, replaced by an unsettling silence. Around 11 p.m., Tom suggested we take a walk down to the dock. It seemed like a good idea to stretch our legs and check out the lake up close. Fog had thickened, and the water was so still it looked like a sheet of black glass. As we walked down the narrow path to the dock, the trees loomed overhead, their branches like twisted arms reaching out in the darkness. We stood at the end of the dock, staring out at the lake. "Creepy, huh?" Matt said, trying to lighten the mood, but his voice had an edge to it. The fog had swallowed up most of the lake, and we couldn't see more than a few feet in front of us. Suddenly, Chris nudged me. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. We all stopped and listened, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing but silence, but then we heard it. A faint splash, like something had disturbed the water. We stood frozen, trying to figure out if it was just a fish or something else. But the water remained still. "Maybe it's just wildlife," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. We decided it was best to head back to the house, but as we turned to leave, Jason stopped. "Guys, look," he said, pointing toward the woods. A faint light was flickering between the trees, just beyond the edge of the path. It wasn't the glow of a flashlight or lantern. It was something faint, almost unnatural. We all exchanged uneasy glances. "Who would be out here?" Matt muttered, his usual bravado gone. We hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or retreat to the safety of the house. Against our better judgment, we decided to follow the light, figuring it might just be someone from a nearby cabin, even though we hadn't seen any other houses nearby. As we walked deeper into the woods, the light grew brighter, leading us further away from the house. The trees closed in around us and the fog thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. My heart was pounding, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to admit I was scared. Suddenly, the light vanished. We stopped in our tracks, confused. One second it was there, and the next, it was gone. We stood in the dense fog, listening. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but not quite human. It was coming from the direction of the lake. Without thinking, we all turned and ran, sprinting back toward the house. The path seemed longer than before, and the fog was so thick now that we could barely see where we were going. The growling sound grew louder, as if something was following us. My lungs burned as we ran, and I could hear the others panting behind me. We burst through the front door of the house, slamming it shut behind us. For a few moments, none of us spoke. We were all too shaken, trying to catch our breath. The sound had stopped, and the house was eerily quiet. "What the hell was that?" Jason finally gasped. No one had an answer. We locked all the doors and windows, not daring to go back outside. For the rest of the night, we stayed huddled together in the living room, too scared to sleep. Every creak of the old house made us jump, and we kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at us from the fog. The next morning, we packed up and left the lake house as quickly as we could. We didn't talk about what had happened, but I knew none of us would ever forget that Halloween night at the lake. Whatever was out there in the fog, we had no desire to find out. What do you think really happened that night? Share your thoughts in the comments.